Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Just one day after rumours started to emerge that Franco Colapinto could well be joining the Red Bull family for next season, there's been another surprise announcement overnight. Helmut Marko, Red Bull's chief advisor, saying straight up, Mark Webber, the manager of Oscar Piastri, has been rapidly trying to instigate talks to potentially allow Piastri to come to Red Bull for next season or potentially beyond. Red Bull need a driver to replace Perez, and probably in the medium term, they need a driver to really take over from Max Verstappen as their number one. Could Oscar Piastri be the man? Would it make sense for Piastri, for Mark Webber, knowing his history in that organisation with number one drivers, and also for McLaren? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you are new as always. Plenty to get into. First of all, Lauren McKees and RB finally admitting that the way they handled the Daniel Ricciardo departure saga was an absolute shambles. Says, we could have done a better job. We should have done a better job. Ricciardo is an interesting candidate because there has been a time in recent memory in Ricciardo's case when an Aussie driver came into a dominant Red Bull team alongside a teammate who had just won 4 consecutive World Drivers' Championships, and the rest since then is history. Ricciardo versus Vettel was a very interesting year, certainly for the reigning world champion at that time. Now, to be fair, back then, of course, it was massive change in regulations, but Vettel ends up leaving, goes to Ferrari in what has of course gone down in history as a very impressive performance from Ricciardo. Could Piastri try and come to Red Bull and do the same thing? Would he be able to? That's another question and probably a different story. But definitely Red Bull know they could have done a better job of the whole Ricciardo stuff. Mexico, though, is coming up in a couple of days' time, and these drivers will be back in the car in FP1. Ollie Bearman with a free practice session, and of course the same story for Andrea Kimi Antonelli back in the Mercedes car, of course. Bearman's done tests and FP1 sessions in the Haas before, doing one in a Ferrari, though, an exciting prospect, of course. He was in a car, in a Formula 1 car, twice this season, once in Jeddah, where he scored points for Ferrari, and once in Baku, where he scored 8 points for Haas. And the first time, I think, ever, at least in a very long time, a driver has done that, scoring points for 2 different teams in the same season. Certainly your first ever 2 races for 2 different teams in the same season. We will talk McLaren in a second. And Pato Award, IndyCar star for McLaren, Mexican driver, is also doing an FP1 run for McLaren this weekend. Makes perfect sense, but I will say in a few minutes' time, if Piastri were to leave McLaren and they were to need a driver partner alongside Lando Norris, definitely I think O'Ward would be a candidate driver on their hit list, especially because, let's say Piastri was to go to Red Bull to replace Perez, they could say, hey, we'll get Perez into the team if you're McLaren, but why not then sign maybe a more promising, younger Mexican driver in Pato Award, who's already within their program. This, by the way, is Williams' livery for the weekends. The rest of the car just looks like normal, but this was kind of leaked and then they officially confirmed it. So here you go, they talk about an homage to another time at Williams, which is fair. I mean, the engine covers used to be like this back on some of the classic Williams cars. They had a bit of white on them back then as well. It's okay. To me, it's nothing spectacular, but you guys may disagree in the comments section below. This is kind of cool though. So Franco Colapinto has a tribute helmet design this weekend to Carlos Reutemann, who was the most recent Argentine driver to win a Grand Prix. So I thought that was kind of nice, and I think Colapinto's support is only going to continue to grow over the coming rounds. One interesting and rather big update as well this weekend is on the DRS zone. We saw, I think they did this too in Austin, shortening the length of the DRS zone on the back straight. They're doing the same thing in Mexico. Now, Mexico is not an easy track to overtake on. Most of the lap outside of the run down into turn 1 and turn 4, it's not really that feasible to overtake. You need a good run through the stadium section to get a chance going down into turn 1, and they are decreasing the length of the DRS zone by 75 meters, which is reasonably considerable. It's still a very long straight, but that is a pretty considerable number. Now, the cars, year on year, as they get faster, become harder to follow. The dirty air becomes worse. I guess the race directors and the stewards and the FIA have looked at last year's Grand Prix and said that overtaking they felt was too easy, and maybe that's true, but I feel like last year's was pretty reasonable. I don't really want to have a Grand Prix where nobody does any overtakes, but maybe that's what we are going to have this upcoming weekend. Of course, the start line is going to be massively important, and because of the air density, it's like 2,200 meters above sea level. The air density is lower than usual. Typically, the smaller Ferrari turbocharger suffers somewhat at altitude, but also the slipstream effect and the DRS effect is less less extreme than it normally would be. So overtaking can already be harder than you might expect. But intrigued to your perspective as ever in the comments of whether that's a good idea or not. Mercedes, of course, responded to a pretty disastrous weekend for their team, especially on a weekend where they brought substantial upgrades they thought would help their car. And they basically said that they thought Hamilton's car was okay. They could have started him from the pit lane, but Mercedes thought that his setup actually wasn't that bad. Although Hamilton said after qualifying, after going out, the car was a disaster. The only way that it was going to be drivable was to start from the pit lane and change the setup for Sunday. Mercedes apparently disagreed with that, and they felt like keeping the same car starting in P17 was the way to go. And then after the race, of course, Toto Wolff says, yeah, like it wasn't Hamilton's fault. The car was a disaster, and it just, the rear let go on him. Mercedes also admitted they probably tried to run the car too close to the ground, which of course is the classic problem in these regulations. But I think even those that were in attendance at the track noticed that the Mercedes was sparking loads through the first sector. They were running it super aggressively to the ground, but then sometimes the aerodynamics and the floor aerodynamics will stall in that scenario. And that seemingly is what happened to both Russell and Hamilton when they both spun out at the same point over the course of the weekend. So, yeah, a bit of a disaster. I'm sure Hamilton is, at this point, massively looking forward to next year. But who are the other drivers on the grid going to be in terms of where they're going to slot in to their respective lineups? Verstappen is heavy favourite for the championship, 57 points ahead of Norris, 79 points ahead of Charles Leclerc. If you win every round and sprint, that's 146 points potentially still on the table, 25 per round, that makes 125, plus of course the sprint options as well, that gives you plus 16, that takes you to 141, and then potentially 5 fastest lap points available, gets you to that 146. So win everything, take all the fastest laps, you can accrue 146 points, which means that technically any of these guys can still win the championship. Sergio Perez is out of it, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, they're out of it, and Sainz will be out of it shortly, as will Piastri. The only realistic options, if there are any, are Leclerc versus Norris. More likely what this is a battle for seconds, just because this entire season, there's only been one driver who has won consecutive races, and that driver is still Max Verstappen from the start of the year. Norris, Leclerc, Hamilton, Russell, who, they've won Grand Prix, Oscar Piastri, of course, but none of them have scored consecutive wins. And the fact that Lando and Max have combined for like 2 wins from the last 7 or 8, 9 Grand Prix is not pretty when those are the 2 guys theoretically at the top of the championship. But it shows how Norris has at times underperformed, McLaren have at times underperformed, but also the fact that Ferrari and Leclerc are certainly there on certain weekends. But of course, Verstappen's teammate in, what has been the best car maybe on average over the course of the year, that may of course technically have changed by the end of the season because the Red Bull isn't the best car right now and hasn't been for some time, but Verstappen's teammate is nowhere to be found on this list at the very least, and as a result people have been heavily speculating about his theoretical replacement. Helmut Marko has been yapping again to the media. Man, Helmut Marko's got such a great job, he's just a chief advisor to Red Bull, and all he does is just talk trash to the press and to his rivals. It is a sensational gig that he has, and he's back in the media again. He was asked, of course, what he thought about Zach's comments. So Helmut Marko made the comments that Lando Norris is mentally weak, right, compared to Max Verstappen, and then Zach Brown basically slams Marko and says, wow, I can't believe you made those comments about Lando's mental health, because he talked about his rituals and stuff before the race and all this, and there's always a bit of beef, isn't there? This is Formula 1, but yeah, Zach Brown was kind of saying, oh, Marko's comments were unacceptable, they're setting us back 10 to 20 years in the sport, and then Marko says, I never talked about his mental health, I just said that Max is mentally stronger, which I think everyone would probably agree with. They are deliberately causing unrest. I think this is the key takeaway lately, that there is a theory that certainly the Red Bull front bib T-tray drama was instigated by McLaren just for like PR points, because Red Bull say that it did nothing, and there's evidence either way, whether it was impactful or not. Of course, Verstappen's quali pace was far better than his race pace, it turned out, on the Sunday at least of the Grand Prix, so that might indicate that they couldn't have the compromise that they usually have, or they wouldn't have to compromise like they potentially wouldn't have had to if they could adjust the front bib ride height. But look, whatever. Red Bull's perspective is McLaren are doing this for PR points to make them look like the good guys and Red Bull like the bad guys or whatever. And he reckons that Zak Brown was playing the same game when it came to those comments. So, Marko on top form as ever. He hasn't individually mentioned the words Franco Colapinto in terms of getting him into the Red Bull seat, but they have been thrown around, of course, because the reality is Isaac Hadjar, Iyumi Iwasa, the likes of Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda, these are all potential candidates in that Red Bull program to either get an RB drive or to get the Red Bull racing drive. And right now, the favourite for Perez's seat next season is not Perez, it's probably Liam Lawson after the good result that he had in Austin, but he will need to maintain that. As we said yesterday, there has been a theory, in the paddock at least, that maybe Colapinto to RB makes a lot of sense, or even to the main Red Bull team after what he's done so far this season with Williams. Time will tell whether he's as good as people maybe think or expect him to be. He also made comments about the fact that he, understands strategy quite well and basically says if he doesn't get a drive next year, he'll just be a strategy engineer. Feels like he'll do a great job of that theoretically as well. But the rumour has emerged today that maybe there's another candidate in consideration. And to be fair, the name we're about to mention was in the conversation quite a while ago now. I think it was when Max was going to leave, or at least it was really been thrown around in the media. Mercedes are already courting Max. The team had just started to have a bit of a decline. We're talking around about, 3-4 months ago. There was a big rumour that, well, if Max were to go, then we can't possibly keep Perez because we've got no number one driver. So they'd have to make both changes. And the rumour was at the time that they would have targeted, in those circumstances, Alex Albon's return, that maybe is a bit more questionable now, and Oscar Piastri. Those were the drivers they were considering, and Piastri, I think, makes more sense than many are giving it credit for. Marko also says, we are going to decide at the end of the season who's the best teammate for Max, but what if there's another option on the cards? So as of today, Helmut Marko said to the press, and apparently this is not just Mark Webber and Oscar Piastri's team sending out feelers. This is a potential mutual interest from both Piastri and his camp, certainly from Mark Webber, his manager, and from Red Bull the other way. Ralph Bark here at F1 Insider says the following. Now, a bit of a grain of salt. F1 Insider historically not always the most accurate of sources, but decent track record from time to time, so pinch of salt, but you guys know how it is really looking at Formula 1 rumours. F1 Insider has learned Red Bull has set its sights on Australian McLaren young star Oscar Piastri. The idea, he should drive alongside superstar Max Verstappen in 26 or replace the Dutchman should he switch to Mercedes or Aston Martin. So maybe the plan is for the immediate term, 2025, because of course Piastri has a good contract for then, maybe not get Piastri yet. But in another year, it's absolutely possible. And look, if they need to replace Perez now, is it totally impossible? We know that Piastri went through all sorts of drama with the Fiasco when he left Alpine to go to McLaren. And maybe we're going to get another piece here of solid Mark Webber trickery. So one thing is certain, Piastri's compatriot, of course also Australian, and manager Mark Webber often talks to his former team boss Christian Horner. The two are not only friends, they also owned a Formula 3 team together during Webber's active days. And Marko says, let's put it this way, currently got a beach holiday in Mexico, confirms to F1 Insider, let's put it this way, Mark Webber is looking for intensive dialogue. So that's the theory, that Red Bull are interested and Piastri's management are also interested. Now, when you've got top drivers and top teams, they would be at fault, I would say, to not have some sort of ongoing conversation. You've always got to send out the feelers and you've always got to maintain some degree of cordial relationship between the two parties, because otherwise you close the door for yourself in the future. But the belief is that Mark Webber is speaking with Red Bull about trying to make this happen, and of course, understandably, Red Bull are going to be interested. Piastri has been very impressive this season. In terms of pure pace, quali and race trim, he's not been as strong as Lando, but mentality-wise, has he been stronger than Lando? I would say so. And it seems like Mark Webber has coached him quite well. I mean, the move at Monza and many other examples this year, Piastri has quite clearly shown he is not willing to yield. And Norris is a driver who doesn't quite have the killer instinct of a Verstappen or arguably a Vettel back in Webber's day, and therefore Piastri is kind of allowed to get away with it. But at the same time, Lando has still been in that McLaren team for a long time. He is not technically their number one, but by the numbers, he is their number one. They requested that Oscar back off by an extra second on the final lap, just so that Lando's 5-second pen wouldn't drop in behind Oscar as well, which is, you know, good, effective team orders, but nonetheless team orders that Oscar doesn't necessarily want to have to deal with, especially as he potentially still gets better and better over time. Does he have the potential to be a number one driver somewhere in the future if he keeps getting stronger and stronger? He definitely has some of the pieces of a world championship winning driver. Whether he is the complete package, I still think that somewhat remains to be seen. But does it make more sense than people would expect? Because on paper, it's like, why would you go to Red Bull? Right now, you're at McLaren. They have the best car, and Lando is a beatable teammate, right? Like, he's not the clearly defined number one in the team, and he's not incredibly ruthless as the likes of Verstappen is. So if you're Piastri and you go to Red Bull alongside Max, then, you know, it's going to be a serious challenge. It's going to be more of a challenge than it is beating Lando at McLaren. And right now, the McLaren team has the better car and maybe more momentum going into the upcoming seasons. But from Oscar's perspective, this would be an opportunity in the medium term to get a number one seat in a team, potentially, right? Max has been theorized to move on, maybe to Mercedes, maybe to Aston Martin, maybe from the sport entirely. Certainly within the next 2 to 3 years, I think Max will either move or he might just go from the sport entirely unless Red Bull seriously turn it around. So from Piastri's perspective, he might see that, as might well Mark Webber, right? I mean, Mark Webber, of course, ends up leaving the team, and then shortly afterwards, Vettel did as well, after Daniel Ricciardo came in and did a great job as well. From Red Bull's side, though, it is interesting because would you put Max alongside Piastri knowing that Oscar is going to be a more competitive driver than his current teammate? But still, a Verstappen-Piastri combination on the grid, hypothetically, that would no doubt be one of the strongest driver lineups on the grid, easily capable of getting Red Bull back to winning the World Constructors' Championship, which they're not going to do this year. Then again, though, would it affect the balance of power between Max and Jos Verstappen, who likely would not want as much of a challenge as Piastri might potentially provide? Or would he provide a challenge? Is it so difficult to compete against Max as the number one driver in that team? Many drivers have trialed and failed over the last few years. So intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, but I think my feeling is that really both parties are thinking about this in terms of a Verstappen succession plan, as Piastri potentially getting a year or two alongside Max in the team, and then whatever happens from then, maybe Piastri becomes the number one driver for the team in the longer term, and that may benefit Piastri and Red Bull themselves more so than what's currently going on. So intrigued to your thoughts as ever in the comment section below. I thought this is pretty funny. An Aussie joining Red Bull to team up with a consecutive 4-time champion whose name begins with VE. You know, I've seen this story before, and I think McLaren have to be a bit careful about what they do, because they're still saying at McLaren that they don't want to destroy the balance of the team by forcing team orders for their respective drivers if they don't absolutely have to. They're definitely prioritizing the constructors over the drivers. Both are winnable, and they have been winnable for some time, but it seems like McLaren are promoting one over the other, and they want to keep Oscar happy. But at the end of the day, if Oscar can leave and he has a good opportunity to go somewhere else, he may well do so. So I'm not sure McLaren are necessarily going about this the right way as it stands. But yeah, our focus has always been on collaboration, something bigger than Lando, something bigger than Oscar that's in the interest of McLaren. That aspect is non-negotiable, which is fair, but I don't know if it's the most effective approach, I guess one might argue. But intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Now, Oscar might have a different opinion depending on the way the rest of the season goes. If McLaren genuinely have the strongest car over the last few rounds and Red Bull's car becomes third fastest quite comfortably behind the McLaren and the Ferrari, then Piastri might think, well, even if Perez's seat is gettable, does it even make sense to go alongside Max, especially if Red Bull's direction isn't the best? And of course, Red Bull have wanted Lando for some years. They could never get him, and maybe they do end up getting him at some point. I don't know, like if Verstappen retires, do they go big for Lando? Or if Verstappen leaves for another team, do they go big for Lando, allowing Oscar to step up to the number one driver at McLaren? That's also a possibility, right? But I guess if Webber thinks that no, McLaren are locked in with Lando for the long term, then if Piastri wants to, be the number one somewhere, it's probably going to have to be elsewhere. And I do rate Lando very highly. I think he's incredibly quick, and I hope at least that the battles this year with Max will sharpen his mind and his mentality, and it'll become a more stronger, more effective racer in the future, kind of like how Oscar currently is, but faster than Oscar currently is in terms of quality and pure race pace. And we might get some insight more into that this weekend, because Mika Häkkinen reckons that this weekend is going to be a straight up battle between McLaren and Ferrari, despite the fact that Verstappen has been so good as our Red Bull around here over the last few years. But that was also true in Austin, and he didn't win that Grand Prix. So maybe the same is true at the Mexican Grand Prix this weekend. And yeah, Mika Häkkinen reckons that it's going to be McLaren versus Ferrari for the dub. And I kind of trust Häkkinen's predictions now, because you guys remember when Häkkinen said early in 2023 McLaren was soon going to be challenging Red Bull. People were like, what are you talking about, Buster? Have you lost your mind? Like, have you been on the good stuff or something? And then it turns out a couple of months later, they introduced a massive upgrade package, which actually makes McLaren competitive towards the end of the last season. And now they're probably going to win this year's Constructors. So maybe Häkkinen knows something the rest of us do not necessarily. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.